Yeah, right. Thank you, Jeremy. Hi, folks online. We're just starting because we have a lot to tell you. Welcome to this session on outcomes of ERM workflows. We had a workshop yesterday, and this is like the summary for everyone who has been there, but for everyone as well who hasn't been there. And it's my task to give a brief recap before we start with actually the summarization. And I just wanted to let you know who the team is. That's Owen Stevens, PO for ERM, Jeremy Huff as PO for Workflows, and I'm SIG convener for ERM. And then you need to take into account the attendees who had been working hard yesterday to do all the things they needed to do. So what did we do yesterday? We had a workshop on ERM workflows, and there we started with a brief history of how long are we waiting for a workflow app in Folio? And Owen presented a diagram that was built back in 2018 for ERM workflows. So we really spent a time waiting for workflows to come into life, and that's great. And then Jeremy showed us how you can build a workflow. He talked about the functionality in the workflow app that is to come, talked about nodes and different control tasks, such as starting an event and ending an event or internal data tasks. So he gave a brief intro to how you would work in how a workflow app would work. And then we showed one example. We had a brief use case with some steps to take that we then mocked up for participants to know what they are supposed to do. And then we had the ERM SIG prepare in advance different use cases they have provided for us. And Owen Stevens has talked in the ERM SIG with the participants on the different steps and requirements. And those use cases were then mocked up as workflows for the workflow app yesterday in the workshop. So we split up the attendees into different teams. Each one could pick a workflow use case, and then they've mocked up different use cases. Finally, we had some brief discussion because some new nodes were invented, because that's what we ask participants for. If you think you need new nodes, or if you think there is missing functionality, please let us know. And this is the continuation summary of yesterday's session, and we will start with a brief summary of the ERM workflows by Owen to have everyone on one page, so that we are all on the same page. Jeremy then worked overnight, maybe, I don't know, and has prepared a demo for a workflow that has been mocked up yesterday that he can show you today in the workflow app, which is great. And Owen will then summarize everything as the final bit. So yeah, that we have a good package today for you. Finally, we will have 10 to 15 minutes, I think, for questions and discussion, but I think we start with Owen, who wants to briefly summarize the workflows.
Thanks, Martina. I just wanted, for those who were not in the session yesterday, I just wanted to just recap. When we looked at ERM workflows initially, this was a diagram that I drew as a result of that. And the thing to note, I think, is that this is the kind of diagram that people like me love to draw, and it makes everything look really nice and simple. Everything's clear and it's easy, right? You've got a selection process on the left, you've got an acquisition process in the middle, and then you've got an providing access process on the right, and then there's some arrows back into previous parts of the process when you have things like renewals or you have problems with access and you're monitoring access. So these are and I think this genuinely, I do think this is not a bad summarization of what ERM workflows look like over the life cycle of an electronic resource. But as they say, the devil is in the detail. This there are lots of things hidden behind like what looks like a nice white box on the screen is really a big black box of like unknown stuff. And even though we could say like generally across all institutions, you'll all be doing this, you'll all be doing it in different ways. And especially parts of the process that you're maybe doing that involve people going and doing things. You'll have a lot of variation in actually how you record that or who's involved in those decision-making processes. And also the things like when we talk about like enabling things in discovery systems or selecting things in knowledge bases, you all have different approaches there. Maybe something goes into a catalog, which then in maybe an inventory in Folio, and then feeds out to your viewfind, or maybe you're working in Germany where you're cataloging things into CBS, and then that's coming into Folio the other direction, or maybe you're using e-holdings and you activate things in the EBSCO EKB, or maybe you have another discovery system where you have to activate resources there. So like everything's different then. And so like on the surface of it, this is a reasonable description, but as we dig into the detail, we find a lot of variation. And I think this is where an approach like the workflow tools that Jeremy's going to talk about bring a lot of options with them so that you can adjust to all of those different you can have one tool that can adjust to all those different things, but what we need to balance is the flexibility of a tool, which, essentially like, if you ask, can the workflow tool do this? Jeremy will say, well, assuming this and that and the other, then yes, because basically, ultimately, it's a way of writing code or coding against the system, and hopefully it's easier than just sitting down and having to write a program from scratch. But that's what you're doing, is you're programming the system to give an outcome, and that is always going to be incredibly flexible, but it's work, right? Like you have to do the work. And so we have to get the balance right between what does the system do for you, what is in agreements or licenses or e-holdings or in all the modules that Folio is delivering, what just is there, and what is it where we need those add-ons, those extras that do more because your library wants to do it in this particular way or has this particular set of external systems it needs to interact with, or whatever that is. So I think that's, for me, these workshops, this work is starting to explore that. And I think that even yesterday, Jeremy and I sat down and looked at one of the workflows, and I think he's going to talk about that in detail. But even there, like what we could say is like, okay, there's some things here that actually, from my perspective, as a product owner for agreements, I think actually we probably need to add some stuff in agreements here that is going to do parts of this for you. Jeremy might say, well, actually, this can live in the workflow. That's fine. And it is fine, right? It's fine for it to live in the workflow. But I think if we're going to deliver something that you want as a fully functional system in ERM, then you want that embedded into the main module. And then you want the add-ons from the workflow. So, that's the thing we have to navigate here. And so, what we're trying to do is to use processes like this to find our way, because I don't think it's obvious, like when we set out, like, and this is the thing, like if it was just a matter of delivering this, then we'd be fine. And it's finding the places where there's enough variation across institutions that we can't just say, okay, you just need a big button on the screen here that says renew. It's like, it just doesn't work like that. Whereas in other places, like there might be bits that we can formalize. I think there are parts of the renewal process where we can say, yes, everybody will have this kind of bits and pieces, but then there are lots of offshoots from that you might do locally that, maybe you need to consult with somebody, or maybe there's a team that's involved that, and that's the different team in each institution. So that I think is I want to be clear that what we're doing here, from my perspective at least, is not saying, okay, so now Jeremy's solved workflows and ERM can just sit back and relax and give that all over. No, I think it's part of an ongoing conversation where we develop both the ERM modules and understand how those workflow modules can be used together to produce, both parts of that, the standard, very shared notions of ERM workflows, and that goes for any module, I think, in Folio, versus the things that go beyond that, or that you might want to do more than that. And at that point, I think I'll hand over to Jeremy.
Thank you, Owen. Howdy, folks. I'm Jeremy Huff. My wife would be disappointed because I have the spot on my shirt. I woke up this morning and I put on another polo that had a spot on it, and I was like, I can't wear this. I got to go talk to people. So I put this one on and went to breakfast and immediately dropped it. I'm sure she is. I will hear about it. First off, I just want to really thank the ERM community, because the participation that y'all have given with this thing that we're working on, workflows, has been absolutely invaluable. I mean, from a requirements gathering standpoint, and this is my first venture as a product owner on this workflow app. So I'm learning as I go what is important for product owners, but I have discovered that requirements gathering is essential. Finding out what it is that you actually need to build. And so I really appreciate everyone's participation and interest. Another thing I want to say, though, because this came up in conversations throughout the day yesterday a lot, is that workflows isn't just for ERM, because that has, I think, the nature of how we've been presenting it at this WOLFcon might have given some people that impression. So I think it's a great fit with ERM. I'm really excited for the work that we're doing, but it has applications and across the breadth of Folio. So okay, I think we did 5 workflows yesterday. Is that what was worked on? I think there was 5 of them.
Yeah, you should have been studying them all night.
The thing I want to fess up to now is that I was able to turn one of those into a workflow. But I do think it's a good one. It's one that we are, I think, is deep enough for us to spend the time talking about. And so I just want to set expectations appropriately. One of those got turned into a workflow. Okay. Just briefly, and I apologize if this is repeated for any of you guys, but just in case there's somebody who this is the first workflow session that they've popped into, I'm just going to talk for just a second about what it is that I'm talking about. So these are the components that make up the workflow app. There are 2 backend modules, Mod Workflow and Mod Camunda. They work with each other in order to perform the workflow engine task. So basically what Mod Workflow does is it defines what a Folio workflow can be. It does not, incidentally, implement any of the behavior of the workflow. It just describes what nodes exist, what tasks can be performed. And it works with Mod Camunda, which is a wrapper around the Camunda workflow engine that allows us to kind of embed it in Folio. And it passes the workflow object to Mod Camunda, which turns it into something that Camunda could understand, and then Camunda executes that workflow. And it actually does the work of executing the workflow. The reason we did that is we like the idea of Camunda, but other institutions might be using Airflow. A lot of folks use Airflow in the Folio community, or perhaps Power Automate on Microsoft. There's other workflow engines out there that might be preferenced by various institutions. So it's entirely possible to re-implement this workflow engine piece against a different workflow engine, giving more flexibility to the community. The clients of these backend modules, there's 2 of them now. Initially, we built these 2 components right here, a command line interface and a static registry of workflows in order to kind of actually build workflows and manage them. This is what we use at Texas A&M to run our workflows locally. We I'll get into some of what we're doing with that. But the exciting thing for me in the work that we've been working on for the last year is a user interface in Folio in Stripes to start to visualize, manage, and hopefully create workflows. So this is once this is complete, workflows will actually be in, ideally Flower releases, and you guys will be able to start using them. Incidentally, though, I have had people ask me if they could get this set up, the CLI, start using it now. If you're interested in that, send me an email. I would not mind consulting with you about that. It would be definitely more work for you, but if you don't want to wait for the user interface to get finished, it's entirely possible to start using this stuff now. Okay, and this has just come up a whole lot, so I decided to include some slides here. These are the workflows that we run at Texas A&M. So we got about 20 of them. You can see some errors over here. This is stuff I'm going to have to look into when I get back home. I did not know there were so many failing workflows. But this is a snapshot from the Camunda side of things, the Camunda workflow engine. But you can just see like lots of different areas. We have reports, books checked out by call number report, patron management workflow, or Orchid ID. Minting. I mean, there's a lot of different stuff here, and I just included this just to kind of show that it is kind of a Swiss Army knife, I guess. And some of these workflows can be pretty complex. This is our purchase order workflow. I did not include this for you to gain any specific details about it, but only to show that it starts to look a lot like I don't know, some of the things I was seeing pop up in the ERM workshop yesterday. You can see lots of parallel processes. This is a thing in the bounding box. It's a sub process that can be repeated, kind of on a loop. So yeah, the workflow engine is capable of modeling some very complex processes, is what I wanted to illustrate with that. Okay. So we're going to get into the workflow from yesterday that I was able to implement in the workflow engine. It is the example workflow process for the e-research renewal, right? So what we did is we started with this verbal description of the requirements. So this is a very kind of human approach to just expressing what needs to happen. And as you see, we're going to get kind of more and more detail as we go on. So get reminder, define time before cancellation deadline, got a new cost information from vendor, but the price increase is above a particular percentage, review the resource, reviewing the resource. I won't break this all to you, but raise your hand if you worked on this one. All right, awesome, okay.
And we actually combined, we had two groups work on this, and
that's right.
We also had another, so we had, in fact, in total, the online group worked on the e-resource renewal as well. So we had 3 examples of e-resource renewal, and we did actually combine those together in terms of like when Jeremy and I sat down and looked at it yesterday, to come up with a, not necessarily something that ticks all the boxes, but hopefully we try to cover elements of both aspects. So there are some extra bits in it that might come from one of the other groups.
Though incidentally, the fact that 3 different folks groups worked on this made it a good candidate for adaptation, just because it seemed to cover the largest group of people that kind of had hands-on experience with it. From this is what the working groups were given. This is what was created. This is one of several pages, but very organic, just kind of asking them to kind of break down, given the nodes in workflow as they were presented, what nodes they feel like would need to be combined or maybe created anew to accomplish that task. After the session, Owen and I sat down and we converted what was written on the paper into this, as was pointed out yesterday, fairly linear model, though this does have some looping in it. So I'm just gonna, I will kind of read through. As I mentioned yesterday, all workflows just have a start and an end. This one, we recommended starting on a schedule. So the idea being that this is something that you could just decide you want to check at some cadence, and just keep on kind of looking to see whether, maybe daily, I don't know, something along those lines. After it starts, it's going to begin by doing a request. It makes an API call to find all agreements that expired within X number of days. And then once it gets those results, it starts a parallel sub-process. So this is a sub-process that's going to fire off for each one of the agreements that needs renewal, right? What this sub-process is going to do is going to initially set the agreement to pending. So it makes a request to Folio in order to do that. Then it gathers the relevant data from the agreement. So it can pull that agreement's data in to help inform decisions that need to be made in the rest of the workflow. This is a script task here. So a small script would be written to parse out from the JSON. Though somebody, was it you, Mike? Somebody yesterday recommended having a node specifically for the purpose of extracting data from a response from Folio, which I think would be a great idea, because this indicates someone having to write some script to do this. But the idea of being able to just put a node there that you could say, well, I'm looking for this piece of information, would be a little bit easier to use, I think. And then some e-usage statistics that might be relevant to the decisions that need to be made are also gathered. And at this point, an email is sent out. Let's see, a task which notifies the agreement contact that the agreement needs renewal and include usage statistics. So it kind of gives the information that's relevant, fires it off. Now there's some decisions that need to be made here. Owen and I talked about this at this point for about 5 minutes or so, whether or not we wanted to receive one email per agreement, or just one email that had all the agreements that needed to be looked at. So we opted for one email per agreement, but this shows the flexibility in how this could be approached, because you definitely could model this differently. So because the ERM librarian has gotten this email, the next step here is for there to be an input task that's kind of waiting for the ERM librarian to respond to the fact that they got that email and go to the system in order to provide some input. Specifically, they might want to gather information that's from the consortial or vendor data that might be relevant.
Is this a good moment to interrupt?
Sure.
So the input task, as you described it yesterday, is essentially something pops up on the screen and asks you to provide a bit of information.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, it looks like the input is a thing that happens some period of time later. So you sent email and maybe the next morning the librarian logs on and sees the thing and responds. So how are you going to join that up within a single input task?
Well, the fastest answer is I don't know, but the things that we have talked about doing in order to accomplish this are, for instance, maybe a dashboard widget that somebody can go to, and any of these input tasks that they have pending are available there for them to interact with. I think it's possible that we might build an interface within the UI workflow that allows people to come and interact with a workflow. There have been proposals in the past of a dedicated app just for that purpose, a to-do app or something like that. So it would be a separate app from the workflow management app that allows you, but Mike doesn't like that idea, so we will not do that. But there's a lot of different options, but yes, you identified correctly the nature of this interact. It is asynchronous, and the workflow is going to pause. This input task will be exposed some way, very hand wavy at this point. And once the appropriate person comes and interacts with that input task, providing the information, they can advance the workflow and it will continue on the next step. These were blanks that I told Owen I would fill in later and then did not do, but they're in the final workflow. So then the subject librarian has their input task where they get to kind of make their decision. Now the relevant budget information is gathered, and then it goes back to the ERM librarian to make the final call. So that was the general idea of this. We turned it into something that I knew I could model in the workflow engine. So that was the purpose behind this step. I then went back to actually not true. I then went out to dinner and drinks and at an hour too late to start working on something like this, I started converting it into something that I could send up to the workflow engine. I got about an hour into it and then just fell asleep, woke up at 5 and then didn't finish it. So that's how that happened. Now the jet lag really helps with that. I probably was going to be up at 5 anyway, so don't ooh and ah too much. But okay, then to my honestly kind of surprised because it was I posted it up to the system and it did in fact create a workflow, and there is the top level of the workflow. I'm actually going to try to pull it up in the system. We'll see if it's still in there. But I just wanted to point out that this looks very short because a lot of the work in this workflow is embedded in the sub process right here. We have not yet established how to visualize these embedded processes like this. We have a couple different things that we're thinking of. If I am able to pull it up in the interface, you'll see that once I select this node, the entirety of the tasks embedded in this sub process will be listed over here. But then I went ahead and created the sub process as an independent workflow so we can get a more exploded view of that. So I don't know if how are we on time? Do we want to try to see it?
Yeah.
All right, I'll give it a shot.
I think we could time on.
Okay. I'm going to go to our Aggies. I'm going to try to go to our Aggies wiki portfolio. This is our development team that's been working on this. And I'm going to go to our Scratch environment. Incidentally, I demoed this yesterday, and I do think some folks actually logged into the system and uploaded some workflows, because when I went in last night, there were many more workflows than I put in there. So that's really awesome. Let me see. Now this system does a reset sometimes, so it's possible that it got wiped since I uploaded this stuff, but maybe not. Hey, cool. All right, so here's the top level workflow right here. And you can see that this sub process has all of those sub process tasks as defined. But because we might want to look at these, and someday I do think we will do, we have a couple different ideas for how to, kind of drill down into these processes. But in general, you will be able to view those pieces as an independent workflow. So I created this other workflow called Workflow Embedded, which is made up of those nodes. Now, I don't know if this is going to be interesting or just very nerdy, but these two workflows exist, but there is only one instance of each one of these tasks in the system. So it's two different workflows that are referencing the same task, which means that you not only can share workflows around, but actually within your system, the tasks themselves are composable. So if, for instance, you have a script task that does a particularly difficult bit of work that you might want to use in multiple workflows, you don't necessarily have to re-implement that script task every time you want to use it in a workflow. You can use the same task in multiple workflows. I actually did not know that until last night when I uploaded this. So it's kind of a nifty thing. So as I described, this is what's going to run each, for each one of these agreements. It, like a regular workflow, starts off, does the request task to set an agreement to pending, the script task, as we described, to extract contacts from the agreement, usage statistics, fires off an email, exposes the input task for the ERM librarian, then notifies. These are the blanks that I told Owen I would fill in. Emailing the librarians to let them know that they have a waiting input task. This is the subject librarian's input task. You then have a request to gather the information for the existing budget. You can now email the ERM librarian to let them know that they have their final input tasks, at which point the decision can be made. So what's exciting about this is this workflow is very kind of stubbed out for illustration purposes, but in principle, you know, if I were to put another couple nights work into it, this would be something that we could execute and it would work, right? So I think that's cool. I'm excited about it. And I will get back to the presentation piece of this.
So can you run that?
How do you run that? If I were to, well, funnily enough, actually, because I did put this in with a schedule, and there is in the JSON that I posted up, there was a cron expression. I didn't even actually look at what it was. I just pulled it from another workflow. But presumably, if I were to go onto the CLI and I were to activate the workflow using the CLI, it would get deployed to Camunda. And sitting on Camunda, it would then wait for that interval expressed in the cron information, and it would start firing off that workflow, you know, every time that time elapsed. So this is, in a sense, good to go. I mean, none of, like, you know, the script tasks and things like that in here haven't been implemented, so it wouldn't, you know, it wouldn't really work. But you could get it to do all this.
Yeah, and I think it's really, like, from my perspective, like, thinking about these parts. So, like, we have
if you go up to the top of this one, yes. So for instance, here we have a request task to set the agreement to pending. Now this is there is a property on the agreement to make about renewal decisions. So that's a field that exists. So we can then set, by using this workflow, we can set with a single call to the API that status should change to some a suitable situation. In this case, we called it pending. I think that's what was written on one of the sheets. We could obviously decide what values to use there, but essentially you could set that to that existing field. And at the moment, like, you can do that manually, but what the result of that is then, like, you've got to know what's in what status, you have to go and search for it and kind of do that. Whereas obviously, like here, we could think about having some kind of, you know what that was going to be set to on a particular time, and then you can use that for further things in the workflow. So, for instance, you don't re-trigger an email for an agreement that's already pending because it's already in a workflow state that you don't want to kind of remind the librarian again about something they were reminded about yesterday, if you see what I mean. And if they set it back to not decided they'll get another email. And so I think that this is a bit like, although I don't think, Jeremy, you've actually written what that call is.
That's exactly right. I did as little work as possible to get this done.
If Jeremy and I had like, you know, a few more hours, we could have agreed, like,
sure.
Actually, we could have written that HTTP call because it's just a call to the API, exactly the same as if you gone to edit that agreement in the UI and made that change. In fact, it's slightly simpler in a sense because you don't have to push the whole agreement. So all of, I mean, Mike, you probably know better than me, like what it might look like. There's a request here that says get usage statistics.
Right.
There's, you know, that might be hiding a little bit more complexity. We know for an agreement, you could, you know, we already exposed usage statistics in the UI for the agreement. So from the agreement information, we know that you can make the request to get the usage from the e-usage app. And so, like in the case of you using the e-usage app, we know that's possible. Whether it's quite as simple as just a single request, I'm not sure. I didn't go and look. We'd have to, but that exists, right? We know it's possible. We're not making stuff up here. If you weren't using e-usage, then like this is where, you know, as I say, like we can all agree that one of the things you will do when you're doing a renewal is go and get the usage information, right? But what we can't agree on is where that usage information is. And so, like,
yeah,
this might be like, yeah, it's all in e-usage and we can just get it with an automated call and then everybody's happy. But it might be that it, you know, you need to go to the provider, so that has to be a different kind of task, or a different kind of task in some cases, or if it fails to get the usage statistics from e-usage, it should take some other action. Like, you can imagine how this gets more complicated, but it's completely depending on your setup, because you're going to have a different usage statistics method, you know, maybe to any other institution, but and it might actually differ per package as well. So there are some things here that I think would end up being more complex. I also think there are some things that I think, you know, when I say about what should we support in the app directly and what do you do with the workflow, actually there's some stuff here where I think, okay, so we can there is an existing field that you could use here, but maybe we need actually a direct API call, which is trigger renewal workflow that does some of this stuff, that encapsulates a load of stuff that otherwise you'd need to write into a workflow, like move the status to something, you know, there could be some things that we do just as like part of a process, and we could, so where we all agree, like there's these steps, but it's actually 5 steps, we could like just give you 1 step to do that. And you could do that manually, or you could do it with a workflow. But then there are things like we can't predict, like which usage statistics, where you're going to get them from, what you're using to do that. And there, the workflow gives you the flexibility to go in different directions. And this is all stuff you could imagine doing manually, right? So we change it to pending, we go and find the usage statistics. So this is kind of just trying to oil that and make it easier and make it something that is repeatable every time, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much. All right, I think we are at the end of what I was intending to show with the workflow. So I think that's back to you. Yeah.
I mean, so I think this is what I've just been talking to really, is that for me, this has given me some things to think about in terms of like, I think what I want to do is to go through this exercise. Certainly I want to look at the different workflows. I think we might want to repeat or do something similar again, like multiple times, to gather or at least get maybe people to critique the workflows from a more institutional perspective, because I know that when you get together in a group and we ask you like, what is it? You all have to compromise around like to come up with an answer that Owen's going to be happy with and Jeremy can turn into a workflow overnight. But realistically, you're going to say, well, actually, you know, we have these bits and we don't do it like that. And of course, there may be points that if we want to say, so like, I don't know how many, like, I don't know how many e-librarians we have in the e-resource librarians we have in the room, but if you are an e-resource librarian, do you use the renewal decision field? Who uses the renewal decision field right now? No. So like, if we're going to do like formalize this, we either have to agree, yeah, we all use that and we're all happy and that's going to work for us, and you know, it needs to have these kind of values or it needs to work in this particular way, or we say, okay, that's fine, some of you use it, some of you don't, and you can use the workflow engine to make the decision about what you do in that particular case. But one is saying, okay, here's a workflow engine, go wild and do whatever you need to do, but that's work on you. And one is the community coming to some kind of agreed ways that happens and me embedding it into the application. And I think what I want to do is to try and explore that space and make sure that we're doing the right, you know, where we can come to those compromises, where that makes sense for us to do it, that's going to work for the vast majority of people, we should do it in the application. And where we can't agree, or there's a lot of variation, or there are too many other systems involved and processes that are outside agreements, that we know, okay, we're not going to do that directly, but we know how the workflow app will support it. So that's where I'm going with this. I think for me, this exercise has been really useful, both in terms of like, just in helping me clarify my own thinking around that and what we need to do to improve workflow support, both in the sense of making sure we do the right things in agreements, in licenses, and also thinking about how we can work with the Workflows app. So I think both sides of that. But I don't think it's the end of the process, certainly not the end of the process. I also think it is something that I'd like to think about how we can share best practice with the community around this, because I think that, you know, as Jeremy said earlier, like the workflow engine doesn't care what the module is, you know, what any of it is, what kind of workflow it is. It's a flexible tool that could be applied in lots of different cases. And you saw, maybe if you could read some of the workflow examples that Jeremy had up there, you know, acquisitions was one of them, but also inventory and circulation and all kinds of stuff. So I think that's something that I think we, you know, it would be great to be able to share that our experience with the community and to take maybe to encourage other SIGs and other groups to do something similar. In terms of like, if anybody's who's viewing this presentation now or coming to it later, viewing the recording, if you want to help us kind of go through this process, I'd really encourage you engaging from my perspective and Martin's perspective with the ERM SIG. Join the Slack channel. I've referenced the wiki page there, and we meet on Wednesdays at 8 AM Eastern time. We have our schedule is split at the moment, so we have a monthly meeting, which is the whole SIG, and then we have special interest groups, even more special interest groups on the other weeks. So we have 3 meetings a month, or 3 meetings every 4 weeks. I think that's right, yeah. But 1 is the whole group, and then 2 that special that are looking at specific setups. And the workflow SIG meets at 10 AM Eastern on Fridays. It doesn't meet every Friday.
It's alternating. Every other Friday.
And definitely join the Slack channel for that, because they also announce the agendas there, and the same is true for the RM team. And also if the meeting is going to be skipped for whatever reason, because like sometimes there's just not enough development or progress to share. So you know, not all the meetings necessarily happen, but that is how you can help us realise, you know, I think what I hope people can see as the promise or the opportunity here, and make that a reality. For portfolio as a system and for ERM as a module within that. And I think that gives us time to have discussion, feedback, questions. Yeah.
Now, we all know that in real life, calls makes folio never fail, but if theoretically one did for some reason, what's the error handling approaches? And
yeah, that's a great question. So there is robust error handling available for you in Camunda. We have not employed any of it yet. All right, so you end up with these boundaries that you could set and have kind of standard instructions for how to deal with something when it fails. One area where we're really going to have to do a lot of work, because people need it and it's just very important, is logging on these workflows that run, right? Because if you know, you want to be able to look, see what happens. If something goes wrong, you want to see what happens. So I do think that we probably are going to require that any of the implementations of the workflow engine are able to communicate things like information for logging, and then specifically be able to do error handling. But we are expecting that to be something that is implemented at the workflow engine level. So I think that the workflows will expect there to be some error handling and some communication about errors, but it's because the error will occur in the workflow engine. It's something that has to be implemented in the workflow engine. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm trying hard to make it make sense.
I think from my perspective, it also from a module side, it makes me think and why I feel like I'd like to encapsulate some, like, the more calls that you're doing like that, the more opportunity there is for one of them to fail in the sequence and screw everything up for like the rest of the workflow. And that makes me want to think about the types of call that we can support that actually hide a whole process that does a series of things with a success or failure state. Right. So, I mean, we've seen this actually.
You're basically building a whole exception handling structure here, right?
Yeah, I mean, like, we already have some things in like the module where, or across our modules, I'm not sure whether in agreement specifically, but where you have that situation where it's one action on the point of view of the user, but the system's doing several things and then giving us a success or fail. And in those cases, obviously, when you're doing it within the module, you have the opportunity to make sure everything happens before you then finally say, yes, it's happened.
Yeah.
And if something fails, to roll everything back and say nothing's happened, which is better than you're now in this weird halfway state where, you know, the agreement hasn't been renewed, but the status is wrong and I don't know.
So to solve this problem, all we need to do is implement not only exception handling, but also transactions and rollback.
Transactions are also supported by Camunda. One of the things that we are trying to be careful of is not leaning too heavily on the feature set of Camunda and locking ourselves into something that can't be re-implemented in another workflow engine, but we'll do it.
I just want to mention, there is a question in chat by Kristen. How do permissions work for the workflows? For example, could a user who lacks permissions to edit certain apps be able to edit them via a workflow?
So currently workflows are terrifying because we have not implemented a healthy permission set of circumstances for them. That has been incidentally one of the main areas of discussion in the workflow SIG. One of the reasons why we haven't implemented something when it comes to permissions is because when we do, we want to get it right. We want to do the right thing. There's a lot of different options for us. I think the model that seems to be most popular for us to implement at this point is a model where there are permissions surrounding the ability to create and manage a workflow. And then there is like kind of an access list that you can set for a workflow that kind of will grant the person permission to execute a workflow. And we also intend to dynamically infer from a workflow what permissions are implicated in the execution of that workflow. So that when you look at a workflow, you can see, well, this workflow is going to require these permissions to run, but the permission to execute a workflow will not be the sum total of all of those, but just an execution workflow. And we, at that point, would leave it up to policymakers to decide who they grant permission to. So it would be like kind of a trust thing. That would be the most straightforward way of doing it. An alternative, and maybe we could make this configurable. An alternative would be to require a person to actually have as their user all the permissions that are implicated by the workflow. That would also be possible to do. A little harder, but definitely possible.
And Kristen just added that oops, wiped out the agreements unintentionally, so she just want to be sure that.
It is absolutely the case. I mean, these workflows, I mean, you could do anything with them, which means a lot of good things and a lot of bad things.
Loop is a bad thing.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
You said that one could choose another workflow in like Airflow from Apache. Have you compared Camunda to Airflow as you made a decision, and why did you choose one over the other?
It's a really good question. I did not compare them when we started this. We were told that we should implement it with Camunda because the community was looking for a proof of concept, and meetings that I was not at, Camunda was selected. So we just started with Camunda, and we knew we wanted to get into automated workflows, but we didn't know specifically which one we want to use. So Camunda was as good as any other one, and that's what we were being asked to use. But in the interim, since that time, I have looked into Airflow, Some of the things that I find intriguing about implementing workflow engine and Airflow is the acyclical nature of the DAG, the A and DAG, which is the Python script that's run to execute these tasks and workflows and Airflow. The Camunda is cyclical and does open up opportunities for cyclic operations. And so that's something that's going to have to be figured out if someone wants to.
Yeah, I will say that I think that is a discussion that the community needs to have about like, what are we going to do here? Because I really appreciate Jeremy's, and I'm speaking kind of from a personal perspective here. I appreciate Jeremy's work to make sure that we're not committed to a single workflow engine here. But I think the experience in the community suggests that if there isn't a solution that's delivered with Folio, then a lot of sites don't get it. And if we are depending on that to deliver functionality, then it has to be there for everyone. And that would suggest that you really have to decide, this is the default, even if there are other options, and the default works, really well.
Well, Mike said he was going to implement the generic workflow engine.
We are at time, but there is one more question in chat. Can you have the workflow set reminders as an input? Like if the selector doesn't respond to a renewal request, the workflow will send a follow-up and the input isn't received.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That did come up in our workshops yesterday. I have written that down as something to think about, because as it sits right now, so I can't think of a clean way of doing that right now, but I'm sure we'll come up with something clever.
So, well, I think that also, this is where I think this interaction with, like, what does the module support? Because I had a discussion with somebody after the workshop yesterday as well, and talked about, in the OA app, we have a record that you can add to each open access request that we call a correspondence. And that is a record that you have either received a request for you to do something, or you have sent a request for somebody else to do something. And those correspondences, like it's called a correspondence because it's usually like a conversation or an email or a telephone call to request that happens. And then you have like a status for that, which is that it's pending a response from you, it's pending a response from them, or it's done. And I think that like if we implemented something similar to that in agreements, you can see that actually, rather than depending on the workflow engine, you could have like, for an input, you'd have a correspondence record, and until that correspondence record was closed,
Yeah.
the work, like, and you trigger a workflow to like continue, or maybe a separate workflow that looks for things where the status is the correspondence is closed.
Or an embedded workflow. Yeah, actually, whoever asked that question on chat, Slack me. I just had an idea for how to.
So I think there are situations where you can kind of just leave everything to the workflow engine, but there are situations where maybe it makes as much sense or more sense to have some data properties on the object in Folio that you're dealing with that tell you, and that's like a renewal, like status thing. It's like, yes, the workflow, you can store that information in the workflow, right? But it doesn't make sense to me that should be stored in the workflow versus being stored on the agreement. Because if you look at the system, then you can't see the status of the agreement. And I think it's the same thing, like the more we record, like where you want to actually then go and look at the record and say, where are we? It makes more sense for that to have said, like, we've requested a response from the subject line variable, but we haven't had it yet, than it does for that to be hidden in the workflow somewhere that's paused, and then have to surface, oh, there's a paused workflow on this agreement. Like that just doesn't seem like a sensible way of doing it. And it also means that, again, you get that functionality whether or not you use it with workflows. Like in a slide.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank y'all so much. We really appreciate your time.